And you are live.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're appreciative for the good discussion that we've had so far and looking forward to continued discussion for the next couple of topics that we have scheduled for today. Our next topic is, let's see, Eric, we'll let you take control over the presentation and you can run the slideshow. It's going to be on the standard setting plan for student performance levels for 2023.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and had an enjoyable lunch break. What we are going to be talking about is the Kentucky standard setting that we ran this past summer in 2022 to review the results of that standard setting meeting. Since we had talked about the process that we were going to use around the standard setting, but then also to discuss plans for a standards validation meeting that we would like to hold during the summer 2023. And so I wanted to just provide those that framework. So to start, we're going to look at the standard setting results from the summer 22 meeting that we just held. It was a full week of meetings that we held from Monday, July 25th through Friday, July 29th and the 22nd. It was a set of fully virtual meetings that were held using both the Pearson standard setting website and facilitated through Zoom. As you can tell, we basically broke the standard settings into 2-day workshops. So we had a set of standard settings on Monday and Tuesday scheduled, and then we had a set of standard setting meetings for Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday, we ended with articulation meetings for math, reading, social studies, and writing. And along with the writing, as we had discussed previously, we had that additional work of combining the recommendations from the panelists into overall performance level recommendations for the overall writing assessment. Panelists. So the way that panelists were recommended, we actually did have a standard setting plan that we did share with the committee, did lay out a general process for recommending panelists, but also kind of an overlay of what we were looking for so that we had representation across the state. KDE in the beginning used an application process to collect lists of individuals across the state that would be interested in participating in different committees throughout the year. So very early on, KDE kind of sent out a blanket request for individuals who would like to participate in any of the different educator meetings that would be held throughout the year. Pearson then used that list to select individuals and then from KDE's list, and then contacted them about participating in the standard setting meetings based on their experience. And then the panelists that agreed to participate in standard setting meetings were provided registration information for the meeting. As they went through this process, there was usually multiple rounds so that we would nominate or recruit a set of individuals, depending on the number of individuals that responded. We would go back to the list and find individuals to try and recruit more individuals so that we could have a full set of panelists for the meeting. It was a little bit of a challenge, as you will see, to go through this. The goal was to recruit about 10 to 12 panelists per committee. In the end, as you'll see, the maximum number of panelists that we had per committee was about 7. So as you go, what you'll see here For math and reading, for math, actually the lowest numbers of individuals that we had for math in grade was for grades 3 and 4, which were 3 panelists. We had 4 panelists in some. The most panelists that we had for a committee were 7 in social studies at grade 5. So the number of panelists were actually quite small. There was actually at the very beginning, we actually did cancel and stop a few of the committees because we actually had too few panelists. If you notice in grade 11, for editing and mechanics and on-demand writing, we actually had 2. We actually ended up canceling, I think, initially the first set of meetings because we had only 2 panelists, and I think in one we only had 1, which you can't set a standards with 1 panelist. Even with 2 panelists, you can't. It's not a really good plan on doing that. We ended up working with the department throughout the week and with the panelists. In some cases, panelists from one committee that was canceled moved to another committee that they were able to then participate in, and it got and we were able to move the number of people in the group up. And we had several places where like in the upper grades for reading, the panelists who did grade 10 reading, I think they also assisted with working on, if I remember correctly, I think it was the editing and mechanics at grade 11, since they had experience in that as well, which gave us some additional panelists. So it was actually a fairly fluid a week of moving panelists from committees to see if we could utilize individuals who were willing and trying to make sure that we had a reasonable number of panelists in each group. The standard setting method that we used, as was discussed with the TAC a while ago, was the bookmark approach. We used that methodology for reading, math, social studies, and writing. For the standard set for the writing on demand, we used a modified body of work method which we presented to the TAC in March. And then for the standard validation method that was used for science was a bookmark methodology for the validation. The process that we used in general was we had the standard setting meetings during that 1 week. From that, as you saw, we had articulation meetings on Friday. Those cut scores then went to KDE for a policy reasonableness review, where the department took a look at the cut scores and made some policy adjustments to the cut scores based on their perception of where the recommendations landed. The next couple of graphs, so you could see, are from where the final cut score recommendations from the reasonableness review landed. And so if you look, they're fairly articulated across the grades, which is one of the outcomes I know that the department was looking for, that there was some reasonable cuts across the grades. Let's see. For reading, you can see the same thing. Social studies, similar. Suzanne, I see your hand up.
To what in mathematics across states and on other assessments, I see differences. For example, in 6th grade, it tends, you don't have as many proficient because of the nature of the content, etc. So to what extent is this reflecting a lot of changes based on what the panelists had done? And then I'll talk about this later, but the number, as you said, the number of panelists for some of these meetings was
Quite low.
way too small.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, since you're showing these right now with regard to, you know, do you want to even it out so much? And how much was that evening out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was a little bit, there was some evening out, and I apologize, I don't have the articulation cuts. I mean, the transition from what came out of the articulation to the final impact. I maybe should have put that in here. But there was during the articulation meeting, there was a lot of those discussions, as you said. Discussions around grade 6, and the other one that we also find is grade 8, where there's also changes, and a lot of students take Algebra 1 at that level and things like that. So I think that there was some smoothing by the department at whenever they got to the reasonableness review. I'd have to go back and look at the articulation cuts to kind of give you an idea of how much the smoothing impacted some of those variations that teachers may have found reasonable based on, like you said, shifting from grade 5 to grade 6. I remember that discussion during the articulation that you get grade 5 to grade 6, there's a little bit of a shift from more concrete to a little bit more abstract, and that transition. And then at the end of grade 8, you have that transition into the algebra a little bit more. So I do have that, and if you'd like, I could pull that up later or maybe share that with the TAC later, if that would be helpful.
This is Suzanne again, Eric. I'm wondering the extent to which we're going to see a report and look at the ratings of the panelists in terms of comfort level with the final, their suggested cuts, etc.
We do have an executive summary that I can send out, and we are pulling together a full technical report that will have the evaluations from the panelists and their cut score recommendations, including the vertical articulation panelists. Okay. Any other, let me see. Okay, I think we were at science. So science was different and I put the science in the reading last because those were two different ones. If you notice, science didn't go through as much of a smoothing process at the policy level. This was a validation meeting. So the panelists actually did go through the validation meeting. And actually, I think everything was validated except for, I think, one cut where the panelists made a recommendation to adjust it. I think it was at grade 4. But that was it. Everything else was all the other cuts. And I think it was the actual advanced cut at grade 4 that they moved down just a little bit, but everything else was validated from the panelists, and so I think that's why you don't see any of the smoothing that you see in the other grade subjects.
I'm sorry, Eric.
So go ahead, please.
This is Phoebe Winter. Is science used in the state accountability system? Do you know, or? I
do not know. That's I was going to see if Rhonda or someone from the department wanted to respond to that question.
Yes, I can do. Science is included in the state accountability system. It's a part of the state assessment results in science, social studies, and writing. So it is in an equal part in that.
Right. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I should have known that. I just wasn't making the connection. Appreciate it.
Okay. The last part of the standard setting was writing, and this was as a reminder. Writing in Kentucky, they have two different aspects, two different parts to the writing test. One is the editing and mechanics assessment, and the other is on-demand writing. Editing and mechanics is a more machine-scored assessment with a set of items that the students respond to. On-demand writing, as you hopefully remember, is a single student responded to prompt that is scored on multiple traits. So this was the editing mechanics, because of the nature, was set using a bookmark method, as we had discussed, with the cut scores that you see, the impact data based on the cut scores here. On-demand writing, as you would expect, there was some change in at the advanced level in the performance, because this is the on-demand writing based on the multiple traits. The last piece of this was the idea and the requirement that for the state, they need, for their accountability and for their system, they need to have a performance level designation for students on writing overall, which incorporates both the editing mechanics and the on-demand writing. So we actually worked with the process that I think we discussed with the TAC, and Phoebe, I think you mentioned this during the last TAC meeting, the pantyhose method, where we just kind of filter things through. And they ended up actually coming with really two defined rules that they ended up coming up with, and how they felt that they wanted to combine these two different sets of performance levels. So if the editing mechanics performance level is the same or one level different from the on-demand writing performance level, then the writing performance level would be the same as the on-demand writing performance level. So what they decided is really the basis of the overall writing performance level would be really kind of focused on that on-demand writing performance level, and the editing mechanics would kind of adjust that based on how close to or different or similar the editing and mechanics performance level was. So if it was the same or only one performance level different than on-demand writing, then the overall writing performance level would be the same. If, on the other hand, editing mechanics is 2 levels or greater different from the on-demand performance, the overall writing performance level would be 1 performance level different from the on-demand writing performance level in the same direction as the editing and mechanics performance level. So if the editing mechanics was higher, 2 or more performance levels higher, then the overall writing performance level would be a 1 level performance level higher than the on-demand writing. This is actually whenever we came out of the standard setting and the articulation process, the table that they came up with that kind of demonstrated how they looked at these rules. So if you notice, on-demand writing is at the top, novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. And so if you notice on the right, you have distinguished, proficient, apprentice, and novice for editing and mechanics. So if we start at the right, on-demand writing is distinguished. Now, as long as editing and mechanics was the same or only 1 level different from that distinguished, then the overall writing would be also distinguished. But whenever it got to either 2 or more, which you see with apprentice and novice. If editing and mechanics was apprentice or novice, then it basically shifted the overall writing judgment or performance level down one level from distinguished to proficient. It was actually a really interesting process to go through with the panelists and the discussions that they had. We went through I think we went through 2 different rounds where we let them make their own individual rounds in the table similar to this and have their discussions. And then part of their discussions was, okay, what were the rules that they were using to get there? And by the time we got to we ended up at the second round, they had pretty much solidified the rules that they wanted to go with, which were the 2 rules that we just discussed. So that was the process, and this is the results of how we came to the creating the overall writing performance level. And that really was the end. And so this was the overall writing impact data based off of the final cut scores for on-demand writing and editing mechanics, and then incorporating this set of rules that the panelists pulled together. All right. Okay, before I move to standards validation, I just wanted to see if there was any questions. Suzanne, I know you wanted to, did you have a question? I know you said you wanted to chat about the number of panelists, but I didn't know if you want to bring that up now, or if you want to bring that up as part of the validation question.
Thank you, Eric. This is Suzanne. We can wait. I'm sure you know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I kind of know. And actually, this is part of the reason, as we've been discussing this with the department, is part of the reasons why we're looking at the standards validation and doing this in summer 2023. Typically, whenever we do a standard setting, you don't have a standards validation the following year. But part of the reason why, as we're looking forward to 2023, there was a couple of different things that we wanted to address that we thought a standards validation would assist with. One, that the student data that was utilized as part of the standard setting process in summer 2022 was based on student performance that is still kind of recovering from the pandemic as one piece of this. And that the process that was used during the standard setting meeting was conducted as planned. The one challenge was that, and this was something that we actually did have a lot of conversations around, the process worked, the process was implemented correctly. The process was implemented with with fewer panelists than we would typically want to have to be a representative population of the state. And so from that perspective, we felt that having a validation process would be beneficial so that we could actually see how the process, the process that we went through with the teachers, we're giving that the work that the teachers did through that process and honoring the work that they did, but also recognizing that we want to give maybe a broader group of teachers the opportunity to look at that and see if they feel like any recommendations for changes are needed. So really the goal is to validate the performance level cut scores for the assessment so that the reporting after spring 23 would not be impacted, but that also that we could have some confidence in some additional confidence in those cut scores from spring 23 moving forward. So that's kind of the goal and the plan, the goal and the purpose of the validation meeting. Okay, Suzanne, I was waiting for the hand, so. Oh, you're on mute.
If anybody else would like to talk first, I'm fine with that, but I am really concerned about standard setting that is based on 2, 3, 4, etc. panelists. And I would like to know, I know that a lot of effort went into trying to get the panelists. I know other states have had difficulty as well recruiting teachers, and there's other methods by, for example, having principals nominate teachers. So it seems like it's it's more than just a self-nomination, etc. But I first want to know why. I guess I wonder why a standard setting even occurred with 2 or 3 panelists. Second, I'm wondering why only a standards validation is being considered rather than doing a complete standard setting for some of these grades and content areas, given the number. And if there is going to be a standards validation, I would open it up so that you're not restricting them so closely to the cut scores.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Phoebe, let me just get, because some of these questions may overlap, so let me just, if you don't mind, Suzanne. Oh, you're on mute, Phoebe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I put my hand down though. In terms, this is related to what Susan was talking about a bit. In terms of the panelists themselves, and one is, I guess the question is, why were there so few panelists, and what are you going to do about it? Unless it's just some extraordinary circumstance, how do we make sure that the next set of panelists is more representative and is bigger? One thing I always I've might have said this here, because I know I've said it in almost every state I've been, and that I think rather than you can include applications and stuff online in a pool and all that. There's nothing wrong with that. But to do active recruitment, so to go to districts and schools and say, we need people with experience with economically disadvantaged kids, with kids who are English learners, with kids who have disabilities, whatever the thing is, with kids who are in deeply rural areas, with that kind of thing. So rather than just relying on applications, and particularly superintendent and principal recommendations, because at least when I was in a state, which admittedly was quite a while ago, we had so many of the same people being nominated, and we didn't do it. We didn't do anything about it because we didn't think there was anything that could be done about it. But I think there can be. With internet and all the data we have on hand, we can probably find panelists so that our panelists are more representative. So you didn't talk about representation during your presentation, but well, an N of 2 isn't going to be anyway, but I don't know the degree to which these panelists were the ones you needed to begin with, or not the ones you needed, even in the larger groups, were fully representative.
Pete?
And I think the only thing I might add to that is, I guess, some discussion with the department in terms of, and it kind of goes back to Suzanne's statement as well, in terms of how much flexibility there is going to be in this validation in terms of the results. If there's going to be no movement allowed, it's almost tautological to conduct it. I'm not saying that that's what you're going to do, but certainly you want to know the bounds of acceptability going into it rather than scrambling after the fact.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of this that you're saying. And Phoebe, I do agree with you. We had great teachers. I'll say this. I had the opportunity, even though I was overseeing all of these meetings, the opportunity to sit in on some of these and have some brief conversations during breaks with some of the panelists. That the teachers that were there were many of some of the times really willing to do what they needed to do to assist and really try to make sure that they were doing everything they could to provide really valid recommendations, or their best, let me put it this way, their best recommendations based on the process and the information that they were given. Now, representativeness, and I think I do agree with you, Phoebe and Suzanne, that there is no way to create a representative sample for a standard setting with 2 or 3 panelists. I think that was one of the discussions that we had, and I don't know if if Bill Audie is here, because I know that he was part of the discussions that we've had over the since the standard setting about whether we wanted to do a standard setting or a standards validation. Because we did have good teachers that did participate in the process. They did do the work. They did walk through the process with the information, with the same information that would have occurred. And I think that with the standards validation that we're looking at, it's really trying to make sure that the teachers know that the work that they did really did they did what they were asked to do, and they did provide recommendations to the state that then the state did, after the vertical articulation, did make some policy adjustments to as we went forward. But Pete, I do agree with you. This is not a standard validation method where basically everything is so restricted that there's no possibility of the panelists recommending changes. We do want this to be a validation process where there is really 2 answers to the validation. Either, yes, we believe that this is a correct location for the cut score based on the content. But then second, if they believe that this isn't the correct location for the content, where would they recommend the cut score being moved to reflect the content expectations of the assessment? And I can go through that in the next step of what's the process that I'm considering using. But I do agree with you. I don't want this process to be a which I think some people think that that's what the validation is. It's not supposed to be a rubber stamp of the cut scores that are there. Bill, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, because I know that you were part of this all of these discussions.
As many of you have observed standard setting, it's interesting to do it on a virtual, in that you're able to get around to all the rooms in sort of a less intrusive way. So without doing a formal study, my judgment was that the conversations were of appropriate quality. In other words, without exception, every panel I stepped in on was dealing with the performance levels and the assessment. They were not getting off on extraneous, their personal experience or what they heard. And so and then even at the articulation conversations, they were still going, well, we're not going to go further because that would undermine the connection between the performance level statement. So perception is that we lacked representation, but what we got from the panelists who were there was what was intended. So they gave their appropriate judgment. The other sort of threat to validity of the low numbers is that for the final articulation, the department didn't have sufficient variation among panelists to use as a guide for what would be a reasonable amount of smoothing across grade levels. In other words, at some point, states often look at, well, we can only go one standard deviation away from where the panelists did. That just wasn't appropriate with 2 or 3 panelists. So a potential problem is over smoothing at the end. So maybe a little more long-winded than you wanted, Eric, but that's the judgment, is that we got what we intended from the panelists, we just didn't have enough panelists. And so we want the session next time to try and add to it and make sure we're where we need to be.
So I think in a way what we're looking at is maybe, and Suzanne, I think we've used this term in other situations where it's kind of somewhere between a standards validation and standard setting, where we do want to bring into the process the cut scores that were a result of the standard setting that was done by the teachers that were there and the process that these went through, but then at the same time allowing the panelists to really provide their recommendations through the process that we end up using. Sorry, saw your hand up. Go up.
This is Suzanne. I think it's difficult to say that you got the outcome that you want when it's based on 2 panelists or 3 panelists. I agree the process might have been the same and that outcome was probably the process was probably implemented very well, but I am truly concerned about a cut score based on 2 or 3 panelists. And I'm wondering if there's a way to think about, for some, like for mathematics, maybe it should be just a straight standard setting. When you look across the board, the number of panelists was minimal. The same thing with editing and, I'm sorry, the other,
Mechanics.
If that needs to be, I mean, maybe social studies, I think, was the one that had 7. That you leave alone. Maybe you don't even need a validation for that, though it might be difficult to do some and not others. But I would like the state to entertain the possibility of doing a straight standard setting for some of these content areas and grades. And if not, and you're doing the validation, I would not just use one standard error of measurement, because you are restricting them to think about within a narrow range. I think that's on your next slide.
So let me clarify if I misspoke. I don't think anyone is saying we got what we wanted as a result. What I was trying to communicate was that from the panelists, each panelist contributed appropriately. So we had valid information from a too small, too little representative sample. So that to me said, we'd like to find some way to include the work that they did rather than start over in some cases. But I take your point in terms of how to do that and whether that's possible.
Phoebe, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, and I'm still curious as to how how
Yeah,
new panel is going to, the same issues won't come up so that you have too few panelists. If you don't know why. I mean, that is a really, but that's, I don't know if it, I mean, I'm sure it could be anything. It could be that the Kentucky Derby was running or you know, or something like that, or in case of Carolina and Clemson were playing. So I would, but it's important to know why so that the same thing doesn't happen this time.
I do agree with you, and I think that there has been some discussions around the recruitment process with and I don't know all of the discussions that have occurred, but there have been some discussions around the length of time that they allowed for the recruitment process to occur. So they may not have allowed as much time to recruit individuals and to go through the various rounds of recruitment that they would need to, or especially since the plan was doing this in the summer, to make sure we got in touch with individuals and put this meeting onto their schedule early enough so that they didn't have other activities or other meetings or other things around the during the summer that would not allow them to participate. So I think that timing is one of the big factors that we are looking at, and really making sure that we do start the recruitment process much earlier. And I also, Phoebe, I do agree with you. I think the idea of direct recruiting is something that is beneficial to make sure that you get not just a convenient sample to some degree of people that are willing, but you're really gathering people that that you need, that are representative from both the regions and the different student populations that you really want to have represented during the process. And I think that's something that we could be discussing with the state, and how we could encourage that or be part of that. Ellen, I think it's Elena, sorry. I saw your hand.
That's all right. This is Elena. And, you know, we have the KDE staff here, and I think it would be great to also hear from them in terms of looking at these cuts. I mean, does this feel plausible in terms of, does this kind of, do you feel similarly that perhaps there's a lot of over smoothing that may be taking place, because these do look very uniform across areas where we would not expect it to quite look that way. And if that's the case, I think you're also partially answering this question about, should we also move forward with a full kind of standard setting, or perhaps a validation is adequate for exactly what Suzanne mentioned? Maybe grade 7 social studies is just fine, leave it as such. So I think it's just also important just to also invite just some perspective from the department here, because we can guess at these things, but I think you have more contextual knowledge and understanding of what you're seeing here.
I didn't know. So based on that, Rhonda or Kevin, I didn't know if someone from the state would want to respond.
Sure, I'll come on and I'll see if Kevin, and I think some of the conversation really is around the smoothing technique. So we also utilized our psychometric support. So we may want Bill to also take a little bit of lead here, or maybe we work with Humro as well. And again, obviously, because we're here talking about this, we're concerned as well about the number and representative nature of the panel. I will share with Phoebe that we did lose some of our panelists because of the Eastern Kentucky flooding. That certainly made a lot of national news. That certainly didn't explain every committee having lower numbers. We have found it with all activities of the department to be a challenge to get teachers involved. This has happened in our not only in our work in assessment, but also our work in the areas of curriculum activities, PD-oriented activities. I do think teachers have sort of a level of COVID exhaustion as they were finishing out the year. And even though we did primarily go from an application process, and it was really for a huge pool of teachers for a variety of activities, we had people who then did not move forward into the work. And so I do like your suggestion of doing some targeted recruitment and to make sure that we have that panel coming forward. Now, when we got to the point of looking at smoothing, I'm going to ask one of the technical guys to talk a bit more about that. But we did look a bit, at the numbers and if we had anything that was too outlying with a very small group. As you may have, we mentioned earlier, science did not have a traditional standard setting, and the decision was made not to make any movement in science. I believe we didn't move anything in science.
Mhm.
And so we stood with the original cuts. So let me pause for a second and see who you think is most appropriate. I don't know if it's Kevin or Bill that might want to come over and talk a little bit about the smoothing itself.
Yeah, maybe I can just some historical perspective in Kentucky around the department's final smoothing or approval of it. And that's where, in order to be sure that the department was recognizing and staying appropriate to the recommendations from panelists from the past well-numbered panels, they did use a statistical method that the department would refrain in most cases from making a change in the cut point beyond a normal range of the panel's variation. So if panels were very strongly in agreement at a point, the department was less likely to change it. That was not possible in this case because of that. So that it just wasn't available to the department in terms of making their decision. So that's I think as far as I'm going in terms of what we did this past year with the final smoothing. The other thing, I don't know, Rhonda, if you want to say that there is a context of, again, wanting to not, to whatever extent possible, ignore or completely change standards from the previous year. The state has, well, these new standards were supposed to be in place in 20. That didn't happen. Right. 2021, we had a shortened test because there were still concerns. 2022 is the first result, and to be, decision makers are impatient with not being able to have trend data.
Right, right. There's certainly pressure, and again, we need to meet technical expectations, but there is pressure that we be able to do some looks back. And, we have been with all the change and with COVID and this being the first truly operational of a program that was put in place in 20, there's a great pressure in making sure we can do some level of comparison. As you heard from Humro, there was some work done in analysis. We didn't have items in common. It was only looking at students across time. So that is just, again, another factor that is kind of layered into all of this work.
Pete, Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just gonna, the dilemma, I think, is well laid out. In other words, we don't have full confidence in where these cut points were set in several subjects. How much we're going to do in terms of redoing or validating, it might make sense for Eric to get into the proposal and then discuss from that whether it seems to be meeting the time we've got.
Pete, I saw your hand go up. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, here we go. Okay, sorry about that. Just a quick comment. I'm not, this is not my area of expertise in terms of recruiting teachers, but given the importance of it, and I don't know what the requirements are in Kentucky, but my sense is in a lot of states, teachers have ongoing professional development requirements that they need to meet each year, and I think standard setting is a fantastic professional development opportunity, and if teachers were given credit for attending, I think you might build some demand for it, as well as providing some needed information for teachers. So just a quick option for thinking about how to recruit more teachers.
I think that's a great idea, Pete. We can look into that. I think there is not really a requirement for teachers. There are for administrators, but that doesn't mean we can't maybe have some sort of recognition, because most teachers keep some sort of professional portfolio as they move forward. So even if we can't do something that's a formal credit sort of concept on professional development credit, or ELA credit is what it's sometimes used, but that's more administrative in Kentucky. I think we could do certainly something similar that would allow teachers then to have that added to their resume and have a documentation in their professional folders. So I appreciate that too. Again, appreciate all of the very good comments on this process, because it has obviously been concerning to everyone.
And let me address the methodology, and Suzanne, you did bring up the SEM, and I want to make sure that you're clear on how I was planning on using that. So the methodology that we were looking at as a validation, and it's actually even it is based on a full standard setting process, which is the ID matching methodology. One of the reasons why I was thinking about this is instead of using a bookmark, or basically repeating a bookmark methodology for the validation, is that some of the differences that you could possibly see could be due to differences in borderline descriptions that could be created by two different panels. So to avoid that issue, that potential issue with two different committees looking at similar items, I was looking at the ID matching methodology, which is similar to the bookmark. We would start with an OIB, an ordered item book, but instead of panelists going through the bookmark process, they would actually go through and look at each item and assign or associate each item with a performance level based on the knowledge and skills required of the item, as well as an understanding of the knowledge and skills defined in the performance level descriptors. The validation part is actually where that SEM, the panelists are not restricted to only those items, but what that does is it basically in the validation question, it says, okay, if you looked at the items within one SEM of the current cut score, and you look at the content that is associated with that, do you see that the performance level changes from the lower performance level to the higher performance level within that one SEM? If it does, what that does is it gives some level of validation to the current cut score. It doesn't say that they couldn't shift it if they feel like they're moving it, but especially if it's not within that SEM, then what that does is we say, okay, if it's not within that SEM, then we really need to look at shifting it, and then they can look outside of that SEM to find out where do they believe that cut score recommendation needs to be. So I actually did selectively select purposely select one SEM because of really wanting the panelists to have a very high confidence that they believe the current cut score, if it's going to be validated, they see evidence based on this methodology that they would want to keep it there. But it doesn't restrict them to only looking at the items within that one SEM. If they believe that the performance level doesn't change in that region, then they need to go outside of that one SEM, either above or below, to find the place where they believe that the content supports where the cut score recommendation is. And this is a very straightforward, understandable process that panelists can use to go through that, to go through both the validation and recommendation process. And it would give us the ability to utilize the cut scores that we currently have as part of that. I hope that I made sense in the use of that one SEM, and that it's not trying to restrict the panelists, but it's actually putting a pretty high level of confidence for them to validate the cut score. Suzanne?
This is Suzanne Lane. I'm not trying to be overly critical, but I am very concerned about a cut score based on 2 or 3 panelists. And
Right.
I think what you said about why you're changing your approach because you don't want, because the thresholds descriptors could be different. I think we should allow for that difference, because
Okay.
a threshold based on 2 people could be very different from a more enriched conversation of what a threshold descriptor is when it's based on 7, 8 people. So
True.
I think we should allow for differences because of the nature of the sample and the sample size and the clearly lack of representativeness.
So if we did a validation, would you recommend repeating the bookmark methodology so that we could actually have those differences or experience those possible differences in the threshold descriptors? Sorry, you're on mute again. Sorry, Suzanne.
Sorry, possibly. I was just trying to say that I think we should be able to reveal differences because of the small sample size from before. And I think, it might be reasonable to entertain moving away from a validation to a standard setting for some of these areas. I know it's so, and of course, the department has to think about the practical implications, et cetera, and it's difficult to have 2 standard settings in a row and potentially come up with different scores that will be marketably noticed. But I think we should, I hope that's still entertained for some of these areas.
Okay, no, I appreciate I do appreciate the caution and the encouragement to consider a full standard setting for some of those areas where we specifically had smaller numbers. So I've noted that down, and definitely will bring that back up as a point of discussion. Elena?
This is Elena. And I agree with, of course, with what Suzanne had to say, but I also want to highlight that it probably makes sense to be consistent with the approach that you're using, because if you're doing bookmark, then you're thinking about, for example, a hypothetical borderline student in mind. That's not what's happening when you're doing ID matching. And so it's a very different schema that you're imposing upon folks who are participating in the standard setting panel. So I think it's just important to think about, if you're changing up the schema, you're going to potentially get some very different results as well. So you'll want to test it out, probably using the same approach that you're using from one.
Okay, no, thank you for that. All right. Manley, Corinne.
Hey, Corinne Manley. I just wanted to ask or see if this was a good opportunity to thinking of moving forward. If we might want to set a minimum number for these processes going forward, because what I'm hearing is, you know, it's not just that you needed to get the. It almost would have been better maybe to not do that at all with 2. And then not kind of introduce this, are we repeating work? Are we validating or not? So I don't know if it's worth time while people here that have the expertise to say, well, what would a minimum be before where we wouldn't have to kind of debate these things here? I, however, do not have a suggested minimum though, so I'm leaving that open to those who have done this more at the standard setting.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. I mean, we actually did that. That was one of the questions that the state did bring up as the standard setting was getting closer, and we didn't have the panelists, was the end counts that and a minimum end count that we had, and we actually did provide a minimum end count, but then the question came up to once we were there, and we had sufficient number say that they were going to show up, but then only 3 panelists ended up showing up. At that point, what is the reasonable thing to do? And at one point we did, and I'll say this honestly, we actually did, like I said, cancel or postpone a few of the standard setting meetings and tried to hold them later, with the understanding that the department needed to have cut scores so that they could do reporting. And so there's the other constraint that you have a test that students took that needs to be reported, and you need to have cut scores. And so the question with the department really did come down to of what can we do with what we have, with the question of, okay, if it's not the best, if it's not everything that we really would have liked to have had at that point, what can we do in the future to make sure that everything moving forward is done, so that we can make sure that all the cut scores and the reporting and everything is good moving forward. So we did have that discussion. I do appreciate it. I would love to hear if anyone in the TAC has a minimum end count. I'd love to see how close my minimum end count came to yours. So, all right, Brian, I see your hand up.
Two comments. One is, Eric, maybe you could also talk about what instructions might be given. Sometimes when there's a validation, there might be some verbal or written instructions to the panelists saying something like, we're doing this validation, the cut scores that were set before were done with a very good process. And so, we encourage you to leave them unless you have a really good reason. So there's ways to phrase it that encourage people to be more or less conservative about. So if you maybe would talk about the type of instruction that you are thinking of, for example, and how blind it is. Do you tell the people where the previous cut is with a marking it, or do you let them do this blind and just see if it shows up within whether it replicates itself or not? So that's sort of a little more detail about that. The other was, I wasn't clear about, is this a standard error of the cut score or a standard error of the validation of the standard setting judgment? Because I thought you didn't have the second one. And
No.
they're really, is this the standard error of the cuts of the around the conditional standard error at that cut score?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That whenever I'm talking about the standard error of measure, in this case, I'm talking about the standard error of measure of the cut score. As you're correct that with 2 panelists or 3 panelists, the standard error of judgment, which or the standard error of measure of the panelist judgments is not really reasonable to use. I typically use, whenever I'm doing a validation, I use the standard error of measure of the cut score, because that's really the standard error around where that cut is, and how we could, where we typically would say that we have some level of confidence that the true cut score is somewhere within that range. And typically, whenever I do a standards validation, I do not have the panelists do it blind. I do provide them the information about that there is currently a cut score, and I give them the information about where that cut score is. You are absolutely correct, though, that the directions can sometimes influence the panelists on how they want to, on how they perceive the process and what their role is. In this case, especially with some of the challenges and questions around it, I really wouldn't want to give instructions from the standpoint of that we really want you to, almost like we really want you to keep it unless there's really a significant issue that you have, because I've heard statements like that in standards validations. And I'm not sure that really is the case in this point. There is, as people have said, because of the end counts, the number of panelists, there could be various different reasons where the cut scores could have been in different places, even though they went through the same process. And what we're looking for here is if the cut score with the people that we had is in the correct place, based on content, even after the smoothing and the articulation and everything that went on, then I think we're okay with keeping the cut score where it is. But if the cut score isn't representing the content expectations defined in the PLDs, then we really would want the panelists to have the freedom to move those cut scores, so that whenever the state is moving forward and saying that a student is distinguished, and I'll use that as because that's the highest level, that if a student is distinguished, or that the meaning of what distinguished means is supposed to represent is there.
That's really helpful. Two really quick comments. One is I don't know if this actually worked. If you had if you looked at an old previous standard setting with 12 panelists, and you did combinations of 3 on round 1, so they didn't do so it's not quite the same. And you calculated the recommended cut. You can see what the variation would be of using a small number of panelists versus the whole group. And that might be interesting, because if it turns out it's tight, then it's less of an issue. But if in fact it varies quite a bit, and I'm guessing it's going to vary more than a standard error, then this is Suzanne's point. The cut proposed by a small group is not necessarily this cut that would be proposed by a full group, and so we shouldn't be using the small group as the reference point. So here's my second one: is if you ran a full standard setting or a less constrained standard setting, then you could let a policy articulation panel consider the previous cuts and the second recommended cuts and give a recommendation about what to do about them.
That's an interesting thought. So basically what you're recommending is maybe have both standard settings and then allow a policy committee to kind of look at those and how to kind of articulate basically between the two.
Yeah, and yeah, and it's clearly a policy decision because they were both content-based groups trying to do things. So that might be one way, because I think what we're trying to do is it's very hard for me to think about how to have people in the 2023 panel take into consideration the work that was done before. So that was one way to say, how would you phrase it? Another way is just to let them be free and then have another group say how to put them together.
Okay. Pete?
So I think the pie in the sky option is, if you always want to start with the best option, is if you could re-recruit some of the ones who participated last year, you would get some continuity in that way. Now there's time effects and things like that, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. The other thing in terms of absolute sample size, of course, is you could have 20 panelists. But if they're not representative of the state, then the absolute N is less meaningful than the representation. So I think part in terms of deriving the N is figuring out who should be represented, who should be represented on the panel, and then you can make a determination of whether or not that representation needs to happen with a single person or with multiple representatives of that particular element that you're particularly interested in, and that's how you get to your N.
Okay, no, I get that. Thank you.
Yeah, Pete, as an extension, I think it's a tough argument to make that this procedural fidelity is with a small number, because if that's the case, Eric, you could do standard setting with 2 or 3 panels of 2 or 3 carefully selected people in the future, which you might really like to do, but that might be a tough thing to sell.
Yeah, trying to get that just perfect set of 2 people that has the representativeness of everyone would be kind of hard to find.
Yeah, but you can see that why the making the argument for 2022 is all has the same weaknesses.
Oh no, I absolutely understand. I understand everyone's point in there, and in agreement in many of the cases of the points that are being made. All right. I think, Brian, I think we got the recommendations of the TAC and to the questions that we had and the recommendations for what we should be considering from the TAC, and I very much appreciate the honesty and the thoughtfulness of everyone on the TAC as we really do try to deal with what's the best way to handle this issue. So I very much appreciate everyone's thoughts around it.
Thank you for your openness and listening, and you and the department will have to decide what's feasible in considering all the different things, and best wishes to you. Let's go on to our last agenda item, which is the scaling. Thank you, Eric. Tim, are you going to be doing the
Controlling.
the scale scores and controlling the presentation?
Yes, the take control button vanished from me for a second.
Sorry, the last was someone clicked stop sharing, so I'm getting the correct one back up there.
I'll hold tight. You can hear me already? Oh,
Yes.
right.
It'll be up in just a moment.
Ben, you're going to have to tell Teams this stop sharing thing is like anti-human ergonomics. Everyone does it. Clicks.
It's almost done uploading. All right, let me get you over to your slide and then you can take control. Let's see. Okay, you are welcome to take control at any time.
Thanks, Ben.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed like we're good to go.
Looks good from my perspective.
Okay, let's give it a spin. Good afternoon, everybody. Tim O'Neill from Pearson, and what I'm going to be presenting on is basically picking up from what I believe you were presented at the last TAC meeting, and moving it forward a bit, providing a little bit of information around the actual final score transformations that were computed and provided on score reports. And lastly, sort of focus on where the assessment design is moving in spring 2023. Hopefully that changed for everybody. Hopefully you're seeing spring 2022 administration 1 of 2. Great. This information is just a reminder of what went on in spring 2022. The new KSA assessments were administered: reading, math, science, social studies, editing, mechanics, and on-demand writing. They're effectively a couple of score report areas that were provided, and one were individual student scores and performance level indicators. The second being aggregate level scores for subdomains or subscores, whatever you want to call them. For example, fractions and geometry within mathematics. Let's see. Again, this was the first time KSA scores have been reported, and so the scales were originated this year for all subjects, with the exception of science, which was had been administered previously, not within the context of KSA though, but technically speaking, those were there was an equating that was carried out on science. Everything else, this was the first year of the KSA scales. And just a reminder of the guiding principles that drove the 2022 administration were really mandated as far as fitting into a relatively short time window. So there was somewhat of a design constraint there that led to the tests that ultimately were administered in 2022, in which every instance there were multiple core forms with the intention of really covering across the forms a broad array of covering all the standards to Blueprint, of course, but also having some robustness in terms of specific coverage across the forms roll up into the aggregate level scores. And a footnote here that there was no field testing in spring of 22. And I think some of this had been already presented to you, that the intention was to use Roche model based calibrations to derive overall and subscores. That was done. The subscores made use of the parameters that came out of the overall calibrations, and for the given respective items that contributed to a subscore, those were not independently calibrated separately. They were basically using the overall parameter estimates to derive the subscore results for individual students, and then those were aggregated at the school, district, and overall levels. That's a pretty straightforward transformation. Mainly this is somewhat in line with what has been used for K-Prep previously, with the exception of a distinctly different scale score range, 400 to 600, whereas K-Prep was, I believe, 1 to 300. But otherwise, the approach to the scaling was comparable. This was applied both overall and at the subdomain level. Pause for a second to see if there's any comment or question. Again, that this information is information you are aware of. Really, the main focus of today's presentations is on this coming spring's administration. So second administration of 2023, we touched on the standards validation or standard setting being carried out as well. But there are some changes that have been implemented that I wanted to present to you. The main driver, you may or may not recall from what was provided for K-TAC previously, but there were instances in which some of the reporting categories for the aggregate level scores had very few items associated with them, as few as 4 points or items. And that, while it was not on the majority of the tests, it existed enough that it was a concern when it came to those aggregate level scores. Again, for Kentucky, this is of importance to have the most robust scores that they can in the hands of educators. And there was this was a driver for trying to get a better set of aggregate level scores out to the field. So there was a governing rule that has been taken into account in terms of trying to bolster those subscores across the board, and that is to ensure that there's a minimum number of points per reporting category of 10. The intention is to maintain the same blueprint, and I'll unpack that a little bit because it seems contradictory in some cases. I will say, I want to note that for most of the subject tests with that have fewer reporting categories, that we were already almost there with the spring 2022 assessment anyway. So not a whole lot of modification there with respect to meeting this rule. The exception really is, and it says here for subjects, but it really just applies to mathematics. In mathematics, there are 5 reporting categories, and this presented the main challenge, and so there was a decision made as far as design was concerned to be able to ensure that there are minimum 10 points per reporting category, that it resulted in not assessing every reporting category on every core form. So, and in doing so, across all the core forms, all the reporting categories and standards are assessed collectively at aggregate level. The scores are more reliable, and that was really the driving intent here. And there are common sets of items that do appear across more than one of the form to allow for a little bit more direct comparability across the forms, as well as lend to the calibration and equating work that I'll touch on. I don't know if anybody had a question on that or if you want me to move.
Tim, just this is Brian. Just a clarification. It says not all reporting categories. So in math, for example, you mentioned there were 5 reporting categories, and does that mean that on some forms there may be, I don't know how many items, there are 5 items, but they may be in 4 of the reporting categories and not in the 5th? Is that what that means?
That's what that means.
Okay, and that's per form, but the and then for the school, the reporting categories are being aggregated, so there are at least 10 score points across the different forms, and then you have equal numbers randomly assigned students per form. Is that right?
Somewhat. So you will always have the 10 items per reporting category at the individual student level. So those aggregate level scores will be more robust than they had been. And yet the other side of that coin is the other point that you noted, is that a student A receiving one form may be tested on only 4 of the 5 reporting categories, so they would not receive, so that it would not see any items in one of the other reporting categories. And it's done in a way to across, I believe there are 4 forms. One of the things that was sent out was an item planner or forms planner that describes this at a little slightly more granular level. But effectively what I just said is the case. I don't know who raised their hand first, Corinne or Suzanne, but Corinne? What can I?
Yeah, I was kind of taking in what your answer was to Brian, so this, I might still be confused, but do you think that this would be something pretty noticeable to the students? You know, that I'm making this up because I'm not sure what the categories are here. But, you know, that I did not receive any graphics items and other students did. I mean, and so I'm saying noticeable because it would be maybe something where we might understand behind the scenes that, you know, individuals aren't getting the sub-score reports and all that. But, you know, it seems like something you might want to consider. And then just as a matter of fairness, you know, I'm a little concerned that while obviously the subdomains are highly correlated and it's, you know, has its unidimensional structure overall, there are certain strengths and weaknesses that can come into play, and it's high stakes for them. So yeah, and I'd have to look back at our standards, right, and look at exactly where this is tapping, but to not be exposed to the same kind of blueprint of test content, it's something I would really think about, especially if it becomes quite obvious to them that they didn't receive certain test items when others did, content areas. Yeah.
Yep, no, I agree. And the only additional piece of information at this point before I go around the horn is to note that one of the additional changes that is being made this year, there's a need for field testing of items, and that is being integrated into this mix. And so I believe that our content teams, being cognizant of that, would of the last point you just made, have field test content that would be at that level, that would not be used for the generation of the aggregate scores, but would allow us to, at least to the obvious question coming to a student, hey, I didn't see any geometry items this year, what's up? To the extent that we can avoid that, that will help. Suzanne?
Yeah, I know that, as Corinne said, that it's highly correlated, but if I'm one of the students that gets geometry and the student next to me doesn't get geometry, but I don't do very good in geometry, that's really going to affect performance. And I guess I'm just wondering, did you say that the subdomain scores are not reported at the individual level?
Correct, they are not.
Then I'm wondering then, why is it the case that all kids aren't receiving items across the 5 reporting categories? If they're not, and just making sure that there's representation within the different forms so that you can report out at the subdomains. Do you report out at the class level as well as the school level?
I do not believe so. I believe school level is the lowest level of aggregation.
Okay, so I'm wondering why then all students aren't receiving items from all 5 reporting categories, which is at the school level.
Right.
And I guess the other question is, are you spiraling this within the school? I guess, and maybe even within the classroom.
Yep, it's about at classroom level. To your other question, why isn't the full complement being provided to all individual students? It comes back to the desire to have all reporting categories have a minimum of 10 points.
But is that
necessary?
necessary?
Well,
at the individual student level, if they're not being reported out at the individual student level, nor the class level?
There was a desire to, and that's a good question. It's a relative question. That is, this was a point that stood out when it came to evaluation of last year's administration, test design, and the need for better, more reliable scores being produced for those aggregate level scores, and the reality of limited testing time that had a little bit of flexibility built in, and I'll walk through some of the other changes to this year's administration, one of which I just said with the field testing. And so that was really the driver in this case. To get to 10 points, felt like that was a good spot. Again, it's tricky because for all the other assessments, this was not an issue. For math is the exception. And there, I will say that for math, there were several across grades and across the grades, there were several of the reporting categories that just had maybe 4 or 5 or 6 maybe items attributable to them. So I think that was what stood out after last year. Phoebe?
Yeah, I'm still unclear why you have to have 10 points per kid if the goal is to have 10 points per school. So half the kids could get 5 points, the other half could get the other 5 points in that reporting category. If I saw a matrix design, I might understand better, but it's not making sense to have the possibility of construct underrepresentation affecting each student's total score so that you can have 10 score points per kid. And the 10 score points I don't have any problem with, but you said you're spiraling within classroom?
That's my understanding. So
Okay, so it's not like every kid in the classroom is not getting the same form. Wait, okay. So it just doesn't seem that I'm not hearing the argument that the 10 points per person versus 10 points per school. You want the school score.
Really, it comes down to the estimate of the per person. That's what's aggregated. So the per person, if it's only like 5 items for an individual student, it's much less reliable.
Now it's making sense from a decision perspective, though I don't know that another decision might be appropriate because of the construct underrepresentation for the total score for the child. But maybe I'd say a couple of things. One is, and this isn't, to me with the child, it's not so much, wait, I didn't get any geometry items. It is this idea of the score meaning for me, for the individual student. But maybe we need to think a little differently then about aggregation. Maybe need to think about 8 items or 7 items being enough. I know, so it sounds like it's a trade-off. And yeah, if you're aggregating at the kid level, what advantage what does the matrix sampling do for you then? I mean, I'm wondering why do matrix sampling if the number of items a child gets in a subcategory is the limit for it just seems like it's adding this limitation in that seems to go against the purpose of matrix sampling. But I will stop talking. I still need to think about it, and I'd need to see some stuff.
Understood. Rain?
Yeah, and I was thinking if you end up, because I remember we've talked about this in the past, and it concerned me at the time as well. Normally, we would want to make sure that everybody was exposed to the same blueprint of content. But I'm wondering if you do go this route, if there are other ways that you can make sure to balance, for example, the cognitive load being similar between them, and also the level of, I'm not going to use the right term here, but cognitive complexity. I would think that would be some things that could be done on the back end to ensure some balancing of other things, even though it wasn't quite from the same content strand. Because generally, you do see differences in things like cognitive complexity and load and the fatigue and stuff that would come about when they're not exposed to the same content blueprint, right? So maybe a really, really critical or deep alignment of other core things that would ensure some level of fairness for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Suzanne?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my comment about one child receiving geometry and the other perhaps not receiving geometry had nothing to do with whether they like it. It's if one child has differences with regard to how they perform in geometry, then that's going to impede the score. And I guess there is trade-offs, and thinking about how precise you need it at the school level. And I think once you're aggregating it up, it gets more precise versus ensuring that your individual student, where there is stakes for the students on these tests, is allowed to show what he or she knows across the content areas. And I guess I would perhaps you have to look at what if, well, you can't do that because you got to have items, but to consider, is 7 items enough? And you probably could do some kind of simulation on it. If 7 items is enough per reporting category for ensuring precision at the school level while allowing the full construct to be represented to each of the students. Something like that. I just threw out 7 because I know that's a lot of states say, you know, we're not going to go below 7 for a reporting category. And that's at the individual level. Not that I agree necessarily with it.
Oh, and I hear you. I understand that. Is your hand okay? Let me see if Bill Audie is still on the call, because he was at the table for a lot of this thinking, and it's and I just want to make sure that I'm not leaving anything out that had been considered in terms of us moving in this direction up to this point, because I know that a lot of what you all are bringing up are what were part of the conversations around this.
Yes, if you remember several meetings ago, we talked about different options for aggregating so that we could sort of address this issue. The bottom line is, given the Pearson engine for generating reports, the only way to do a school score is to take the average of the student scores. And therefore the judgment was it's more reliable to have a average of more reliable scores than to take an average of 4 items scores. So that's the rough basis. You can, I don't have the forms in front of, I don't know if I've seen them yet. You can have some of the unrepresented items, fewer than 10 items on the test, so that students get some items from every reporting category. But the forms that get rolled up into the group score, the school score, have that minimum of 10 to have a reliable score in that average. Again, if you've seen the blueprint, there are 2 reporting categories that have a maximum of 15% representation, and 2 of them have a maximum or minimum of 25%. So there's no way to do this across students for every student without having a long test. Well, the first test drafts were forms were estimated to be 2.5 hours, and the requirement from the commissioner in the field was 1 hour. So this is a trade-off, and the idea was that the stakes for the student relate to the overall score, the proficiency. Not, well, technically there's no stakes for students, but the key reporting issue for an individual student is the performance level categories, NAPDs, and we consider that these forms to meet that requirement. We have highly reliable reporting categories, and then the program decisions related to the reporting categories are at the school level. So we want to have those be as reliable as possible. So this is the trade-off we've come up with across the constraints. I guess, Phoebe, are you responding to me, or I'm not wanting to take over this?
Yeah, I knew people weren't talking about the happiness of kids in terms of the test. So thanks for clarifying that, Suzanne. No, I'm okay. Let's see. So in my head, because I don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly how the sub scores were being put together and why was decided that it had to be an aggregate of kids, I figured there was some really good technical reason for it. But apparently it is a technology reason instead. And if that's the case, my suggestion would be to still try to go with 7 items this, or whatever, 7 items this year, because you can't change everything overnight, but to add a module that will allow you to aggregate scores in a different way. Or it's disturbing to think that programming that can be done isn't being done when the whole purpose of this whole matrix sample form might be being a little undermined by the technology that is in use. And I might be misunderstanding it, but at any rate, my suggestion would be by 2024, you'd be able to randomly do matrix sampling in a way that that you can get reliable enough aggregate scores, but that aren't required to be the aggregate of individual student scores, unless I'm misunderstanding stuff, which is possible.
Understood. You are understanding.
Fran?
Yeah, I was just going to give a small point of reflection on the record before we move on, that I think it helps tremendously that these tests are not used, for example, an end of course graduation requirement for the students. And I think I believe you all from Pearson were on the call this whole time. So the validity argument that HMRO is starting, I think with collaboration of everyone, right, the department and Pearson, that really helps too, because the goals clearly that you all are coming with are really about reporting very accurate and helpful information to the districts and schools. So I think that helps to really lean this way that you're leaning, to really focus on the robustness of those sub-scores for accountability school level purposes. So I just wanted to kind of comment. I think those things are why I wouldn't go on and on about this concern of some students not being scored on the same content as others. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd moved to the second slide on the spring 2023 to sort of hit on a couple of the other features that will be occurring, one of which I've already said. So this first administration and future administrations is mandated release of content from the assessments. And with it being early enough in the development of the KSA assessments, considering item releases and noting that in some instances our item banks are not entirely robust across the board, that the decision was made that we really needed to incorporate some field testing into the mix. And content had already been developed, so we have a couple of years of content that will be integrated in field testing for this spring, and largely to accommodate that with respect to the limitations, the mandated limitations in testing time. The assessments will be crafted in sections, 2 sections as opposed to a single section as well. And that's intended to help stay within the limits of testing time as the current administration conditions exist. Additionally, this is the spring 2023 scales will be linked to the 2022 using a common item non-equivalent groups equating approach in a fairly typical manner. So roughly 30% of items from the 2022 assessments will be reused on 2023. Item positions are intended to be comparable, meaning same location basically relative to the overall forms as they appeared in 2022, and keeping in mind the integration of field test, embedded field test slots as well. And specifies robust Z drift analysis to evaluate the anchors when we go to do the technical work. That's been used historically on this program, so this follows suit. I think that is all I've got as far as updates there. I don't know if there are, Brian.
Thanks. I had a couple of questions from the document, the what was it called? Forms plan. And so if I understood it, in general, there will be at least one base form that doesn't have TEI items that allows accommodations to be done. But so my question was, I think I read it that the linking items will all be non-TEI items because the linking items are common across both forms, which means that they're not TEI items. If they, was I reading that wrong?
I believe you were reading that wrong.
Okay.
So we will, I believe I'll have to go back and confirm.
Okay, so linking items will be common across the two base forms, and one base form has no TEI items. So does that mean that the linking items are not TEI items?
I'll have to confirm that. Because this was
okay. Yeah, I think that
just be semantics, and that's for the
okay.
reading specifically. Is that what you're looking at?
Well, I think it was a description that was pretty common across most of the content ones. So that was just one question. It may lead to some construct and representation if that's the case. So if you could clear that up. The other was where the field test items appeared sort of differed content area by content area. One content area at the end, another that they're in the middle, and so on. Is there I'm sure there are reasons for that.
Yeah, the driver there is basically item sets versus individual items. That's the
yeah,
straightforward answer, but that's we ran into that as we do.
And you haven't had problems with motivational effects if they're at the end and so on.
Historically, I don't think so, judging from what we would experience on K-Prep. And here too, I might reach out to Bill to see if what I'm saying is factual.
Well, the key point I think is that we're not using calibrations from the field testing. In other words, we're always using post-calibration, at least so far, okay. So that we don't expect that the placement will have a sufficient effect on the kinds of judgments we're going to make from field testing.
And like I said, Brian, to my experience with what was for K-Prep, the previous assessments, I don't recall that being an overt concern.
And just two other quick comments on the documentation where it gives a percentage of the base items. It'd be helpful if it had the number too, because some of the base items, base forms are shorter than others. And so I was just wondering if the linking set ever got down to like 10 items or something, depending on how long the base forms were.
Yeah, that's a great question, because obviously with some of the, especially like reading, where you have a lot of time dedicated to literally reading passages and whatnot. Go back and check. Offhand, I can't recall how fewest number of linking items that we have.
And the last question I have is, it sounds like you're equating the on-demand, you're calibrating the on-demand writing. So is that being equated through the editing mechanics or?
So up to this point, and I see that the discussion had been brought up at the last TAC, at least pre-questions when I reviewed, and at that time the answer was we haven't had discussions around how to maintain, I mean, one of the tricky things is that you're talking about really is equating and carrying forth a single question. So there's that. However, in keeping in mind that we might be able to make some form of adjustment, this year, like last year, there were, for each grade, there were 4 writing prompts administered, spiraled through with the editing mechanics. That same design is holding this year. 2 of the prompts are repeats from last year. I know there's some, and the other 2 are new. So strictly speaking, there's potentially a mechanism in place where we could calibrate freely and defer to the banked parameters from last year and make an adjustment that way. So at least on paper, there's a potential for that. Again, we can discuss whether that's a good idea or not as we move forward. But that's something that we had internally not addressed yet.
But I know the writing on-demand writing's a tough, really tough thing to.
It's tricky. It was hard enough previously when we had at least 3 prompts to work with, one of which was common, and now it's a little trickier.
So then my last comment. This was inspired by I think the comment I read about science, that there was no field testing planned. Was if there's just a note about sort of how item exposure will play out across the future time, that would be helpful.
Be good. And I think part of the answer there is I think that the science, it's the fact that science was originated years ago, and I think that runs its course more quickly than the rest of KSA. But I'll get you a real answer. Other questions? I appreciate your insight and contributions, and look forward to working with you moving forward.
Thank you. The TAC members are so efficient. We are ahead of schedule. I don't know if anyone will object to that. Before we go, well, let me just go to the approval of our next meeting dates, and then I'll check with Rhonda or other KDE folks if there are any other items that you think we should raise at this meeting. In terms of our KTAC meeting dates, we identified 3 dates last time, but we wanted just to confirm them, and then they'll be official this time if everyone agrees. The 3 dates we had were February 14. These are all in 2023. June 13. Those are both virtual meetings, February 14, June 13, and October 17 and 18, which would be an in-person in Kentucky. I assume it would be in Frankfurt, but it doesn't have to be. I think we'll determine the location unless Rhonda can confirm a location for us now.
I'm sorry, Ron, we'll determine it, but it most likely would be in Frankfurt.
Okay. And so people at Frankfurt, those of you who are familiar with Kentucky will know that Frankfurt is about an hour from the airport in Louisville and about an hour and a half from the airport in Covington. So if you think about the travel time, I would propose that the 2 virtual meetings be similar to what we had today. We'll allocate 6 hours for it. We may not use all the time, but that allows us to cover and a little more depth and a wider range of topics if we need to. And then the in-person meeting, I would propose that we start at 8:30 the first day and make it a complete day, go to about 4:30. And the second day start at 8:30 and end by 3:30, which I think would allow people time for a later flight. Out Covington is a Delta hub, and there are lots of flights out, I think, that people would be able to catch. But that's the proposal just in terms of timing that goes with the dates. Any discussion from the KTAC members about those dates? Does anyone not able to meet those, and we might have to look for another one? People are okay? Okay, we'll go ahead and Rhonda will confirm those dates then, and those suggested times, and in particular, if KDE will do its magic in finding a meeting place for us, then we'll let people know where we're going to meet on October 17 and 18.
We'll do that, Brian. Thank you.
Rhonda, do you have any other topics that you think that the KTAC
I didn't know,
could
Brian,
advise on?
I didn't know if you have anything you need to communicate. You may have already done so about, I know you, as you create the minutes, you'll be communicating with the KTAC members, and you may have already done that on timeline. So I know our last topic just says summary, next steps, adjournment. We certainly appreciate the very meaningful discussion today, and really, I think, some very practical suggestions and things for us to think through and work through. So we really do appreciate your time and your expertise that you bring to these processes, and I know it improves us. So thank you for that.
Thank you. In terms of next steps for the KTAC members, as we did last time, I will get a summary to the KTAC members by Thursday. If you could turn that around by Friday, we need to get it to KDE by Monday so that they can review it and then post it. So that's part of the requirements of having a public meeting, is to have minutes, draft minutes appear fairly promptly. And so if that's so if you can be expecting to look at that, and I think it will be similar to what we had last time. It would be several pages, but not super long, and should be familiar to you based on the discussion. What we're looking for really is if there are we want to make sure that the advice is clear. We're not doing consensus. We're not taking votes. So if there are any comments, and if you want to add anything that you think of that wasn't necessarily fleshed out, that would be fine, because we're trying to give the best advice that we can. Rhonda, I think we're ready.
I think so too, Brian. So I don't know. Did you formally ask for adjournment last time?
I think that was we're not very formal. We do take
That's right.
a motion for
That's right.
approval of minutes, but we probably should ask people if there's a motion to adjourn, and we will be back together on February 14th.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
Okay. Corinne,
I'll second.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Thank you all for staying in there for the long time today. We really appreciate you.
All right.